Iron Paws and the Tinker's Forged Marriage, Gears, Cogs, and Puppy Dogs, Book 2, by Juli de Revezzo. Chapter 1, May 1888. The Texas sun seared through the spring afternoon. Only a few birds dared to hop out of the shade for their noon meal. In response, the neighbor's cat went out to hunt, causing a flutter of feathers. The banging across the property drowned out the fracas, pulled part of Vesta's attention as she crossed the farm. A new house was going up across from the house she'd grown up in, but she ignored it for the moment to give the note one more perusal. Dear Mr. Bartlett and Miss Vesta, I received your Clockwork pet, and I wanted to let you know my son adores it. As promised, it performs like the dogs my mother and father remember, and at least my mother loves it as much as my son does. If you have an extra on hand, I'm sure she'd welcome one. My thanks and congratulations on your fine work. Jonathan, you raised your daughter well, and I don't mind saying she just might give you a run for your money. Your friend, Tolliver Aurelius. Smiling, she shaded her eyes from the sun's glare and took in the property. Up on the roof of her home-to-be, she spied Henry nailing in shingles along with a small crew her father could spare. Even now, the thought that he was building a home for them felt strange to her. They'd been friends so long, their love still felt tentative. Surely it didn't warrant something so permanent. Horses whinnied when Henry's hammer fell, clattering to the porch. Vesta shook her head. I should be over there helping him, not stuck here in the workshed. But she had her own work to do. Her latest creation waited inside the house. She only stopped to read Mr. Aurelius's letter. What's the poor fool boy done now? Her father's voice pulled her from her survey. He just dropped something, Daddy. She entered the shop, stopping for a moment to hail the horseshoe over the door, points down so their luck may flow to her father's smithy. He's doing fine. Don't look it to me. I wonder if I should let him marry you. The buffoon might have you sleeping in a tree if I'm not careful. Her father doted, even as he teased, and Vesta was glad of it. She stood on her tiptoes to kiss his unshaven cheek. He won't. You know he'll find space in his office for us to sleep if need be. She was thinking about sharing sleeping quarters with her best friend. When would this dream end? Surely it was so. Henry was just her friend, one whose touches she found herself longing for even now. Not if he doesn't find said office space. He will. I have faith he might. Might, not will. But father, look what just came in. She handed him Mr. Aurelius's letter. Her father leaned against the crank of a massive bellows attached to one side of the oven to read the letter she handed over. Well, well, I knew you'd succeed, my girl. At least someone likes it. Just look around town to find more. He patted the bellows crank. Are you ready to go back to work? She shoved the letter into her pocket. Yes, sir. I shouldn't do this, but just to get you started. You remember what I showed you? Vesta tied a heavy black apron over her yellow and blue gingham dress, but refrained from slipping on their work gloves. Of course I do. Don't think about it too much. Just put the ingot in the flame. If you need it, I'll give you a bit of air to help out. I won't need it. She cracked her knuckles and picked up the cup of ingots, set it in the flame. Then she held her hands toward the fire. Heat licked her palms. You can do this. Lowering her hands to the flames, she thought the spell. Reverie, Canaan, verbemum. Picturing the flames melting the brass in her cup, she cracked one eye open. The cup did glow. Joy tickled her. I did it! Daddy, look! Very good, princess. Ignoring the stab of triumph, knowing she might falter at any moment, she stepped back and snatched a small vial off the shelf. Blue and gold sparkled inside. She opened the top, releasing the tangy scent of aether into the forged shed. Taking a breath, she concentrated further and added 3 drops to the cup. Where the brass would have taken several minutes with pure fire, this measure of brass melted and bubbled the instant the aether met the brass. Good girl, her father said. Keep going. Fingers shaking, she removed the mold from the fire. Reverie canine verbemum. The brass writhed within the mold, settled. Vesta removed it and plunged the shell and brass into a waiting bucket of water, then set it on her anvil. The cylindrical lump of brass rolled on the anvil, and her father stopped it with a skilled hand. There now, that's one piece. He knelt down to study it closer, and no maker's mark this time. Good work, my dear. She picked it up and dried it off, turning the cylinder. A bump shone in the metal. No maker's mark, but see here? She tapped the lump. I ruined it. With a scoff, she tossed the cylinder onto the reject pile. I'm never going to get this right, am I? Her father retrieved the piece. Nonsense. The piece looks like the beginnings of a fine fat canine to me. Finish it up, and we'll set it with the others to go to the queen. Not this one. It's for running clouds, boy, remember? Even better. He patted her shoulder, and setting the piece down, took a hammer off a hook on the wall. The boy's bound to add his own lumps to the puppy's derriere sooner rather than later. It'll be good practice for making toys for Elise's boy. When you bring her home, I'll have one ready for you. She smacked the hammer against the brass. Maybe I'll even make the two of you some wedding rings while you're away. Her father scoffed and kissed her forehead. Think about making your own, although I'm sorely disappointed with Henry that he hasn't bought you one yet. Vesta's gaze strayed to the house her beloved was busy raising. He is building me a house. You can't wear that around town to show he's yours and vice versa. I will be reminding him before I leave that he doesn't want those tavern wenches getting their hearts too set on him. She tapped the hammer against the hull. Daddy, they won't. No? Her father took the hammer from her and added a bit more force. You forget, my outfit included many Irish and British boys. That was how he'd met Henry's father. George, as a young man, visited Charleston for some adventure, and the fool, not having paid much attention to the particulars of the sides in the war, almost signed up with the Confederate Army. Jonathan directed him to the Union, and though her father ended up enlisting in Sherman's army, he'd talked George into not signing on the dotted line. Instead, he'd sent him out here, and between them found what was to become this ranch. Eventually, Jonathan sent George home to Nottingham, where he belonged. I've seen the way girls look at foreign boys. She hadn't much choice. When they were toddlers, their fathers, drunkenly, she thought, made their pact when her father said, You're lucky, George, you've sons to leave your property to. If our children marry, George had said, you'll not have that worry. And so the betrothal was struck. Vesta was glad now that she'd been able to alter the agreement. You might be remembering wrong. Henry cursed from outside, drawing Vesta's attention. I've forgotten how hot Texas can get. You'll get used to it. Tools filled the bench and the wall of the shed, and her father stood there looking them over to select a new hammer. Did you come up with a new design, darling? Henry asked. Not yet. Why, she didn't know. She liked no idea she hatched. Maybe she was thinking too much about the plans for the day she and Henry married. The day was only a few weeks away. Henry approached and kissed her. What can your clockwork pets do about this heat? She wrinkled her nose playfully and thought he'd need a bath before the day was out. Would you like to get on the airship with Daddy? Acton must have use for you back home. I'm sure he won't mind if you don't clean up much. Her father had his own thoughts on the matter. More likely, your brother needs your help. You're probably right. Henry pushed the bandana into his back pocket, but Vesta noticed she still had his full attention. Are you in the middle of a project? I thought we were going out tonight. Which reminded Vesta, and she looked to the angle of the sun. It's a bit late for shopping. He's right. Leaning against one of the shop tables, he glanced at the silver pocket watch her father had set there, open but out of the way. It's 4:45. Was it so late? The general store may not be open much longer. Her father stepped between them. He didn't need to. She saw plenty of space next to Henry for him to reach for a different clamp. You'll be looking for wedding rings, I hope. Among other things, Vesta kissed Henry's cheek. The scent of working, sweaty man made her wrinkle her nose. Clean up first. As Henry went to the well and poured water over his head, she swept dust off the anvil and siphoned it into a bottle and then put her work away. Ducking into the house, she placed the anvil dust in her father's charm cabinet, washed her face and hands, and changed into a pearl pink walking dress. Henry met her again a quarter of an hour later and helped her into her father's cart. "I have something for you." "You do?" What could he have done in 15 minutes? He reached under his seat and pulled forth a trio of wildflowers, crushed. Color tinged his cheeks. "These are for you, my love. I was going to say you're as pretty as they are, but I didn't think about how they'd look." He cursed and raised his hand. Vesta thought he might toss them over the side, so she grasped at them. "They're pretty." She kissed his cheek. "And you're adorable. I love you for trying." Someone cleared a throat. Vesta looked back to see her father staring at them. He raised a pitchfork and leaned on it. "Stop trying to buy my daughter out of her dress, Colchester." His warning forced a surprised laugh from her. "Daddy!" He helped her chaperone, Miss Della Grimes, into the cart, and Vesta drove into town. They parked in an open field where many others left their carts for a day's shopping trip and strolled through the dusty town street to the general store. Flyers posted on walls and posts proclaimed the upcoming Queen City annual puppy race. She sniffled. "I wish they wouldn't use the word puppy." Henry laced his arm around her. "When we don't have puppies anymore, it doesn't make sense. It sounds like fun, though. I can't wait to see it." He read over it a moment. "May 28th. You know, that's not too far from our wedding, but gives you enough time." "Time for what?" "Why don't you enter one of your puppies in the race?" "My puppies?" She waved a hand in the direction of her father's farm. "You mean my automatons?" "Those. Why not?" Shaking her head, she tugged open the door to the general store. "Don't be silly. Besides, they're not mine. You know they all belong to the Queen." Miss Grimes pointed out a set of drapes on display. "My word, Miss Vesta, don't you think those will be lovely in your new kitchen?" Henry nodded, but Vesta thought his agreement was a little more vapid than Miss Grimes hoped. He led her away to show her more substantial furniture, a chest, a table, and chairs. "What do you think of this? The fellow tells me it's something called Florida pine." Vesta studied the slats, whose fine filigree cutouts reminded her of hearts. "It's a little too frilly for me." "You don't like excessive decoration, miss? I understand." The shopkeeper led them to another shelf. "Here's a plainer design." "I don't know." Henry placed his hand on Vesta's arm. "Would you happen to have any with vials of aether etched into them?" "Excuse me?" The shopkeeper turned back from the shelf. Vesta squeezed Henry's hand. "I meant to say gear designs, like wee wheels." Henry patted her back. "If I know my bride, she'll like that better than any other design." His bride. She was marrying her best friend. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The shopkeeper offered his congratulations. "Ah, yes, wheels. The design is most popular. I don't have any in stock right now, but I can order some from Austin for you." Henry stepped back. "I don't know." "Wait." The shopkeeper held his hands up. "I know of a woodworker in Dallas. He may take a special order. If you might contact him for us, I'd appreciate it." Henry paid an installment for the supplies he'd come for, and once again drew the shopkeeper aside for a private word. When they finished, Henry led she and Miss Grimes outside. Here they found two girls, one surely 16, waiting impatiently for a sister younger than herself, who ran after a brass-skinned dog no taller than her ankle. The girls saw them, and the youngest waved. "Thank you, Miss Vesta. I love my puppy." She looked down at the brass dog. "Go on, girl. Go say hello." The automaton paused, then trotted up to Vesta and knelt down at her feet. Vesta smiled and patted the solid brass head, the small spines of brass that made up its fur tickling her palm. "Good afternoon, Moonbeam." She looked to the little girl. "You decided to name it so, if I recall, Miss Schaefer?" "Yes, miss." "And no problems with your pet?" "Not at all," the girl said. "Though," her sister said, "Daddy wondered what to do if the tank goes empty." Vesta pulled a small pad from her reticule. "I'll send some of its fuel over to you." Miss Schaefer curtsied and ran off, the dog at her heels. Her older sister dipped her head. "I'm sorry my sister bothered you." "Oh," Vesta waved a hand. "It's no bother at all." The elder Miss Schaefer nodded again before departing with a polite, "Good day, Miss Bartlett." When she returned home, she handed her father the race flyer. I think I could win this, don't you? Are you going to keep one of your puppies back from the Queen? Looking to their forge, she considered. Can I? No, I can't. I promised her 50. You're right. She wouldn't be happy with you if you send 49. He pulled out a carton where they kept their ingots. I guess you'd better make one more. Ignoring the far-off buzz of an airship pottering by overhead, Vesta picked through their molds, a cat, a miniature whippet, and another small mutt of indiscriminate breed. There, that one might do for the race. It was one of the first puppies she made for her meeting with Queen Victoria's men. It pleased them well enough. How will it do in the Queen City race? The race was only a few weeks away. She'd have time to test it to find out. She picked up the ingots, centered herself, and summoned up her magic. A tingling sensation tickled her fingertips. A symbol formed in her vision. Vesta frowned. If you please, do not mark my piece. Months had passed since she'd last left her mark on a clockwork body, but she still had trouble keeping the symbol from her mind. When the power flowed into the metal, she poured the brass into the mold, let it settle, then gave it a brush of her magic. The brass instantaneously solidified. Leaving it to cool, she forged gears for its legs and ears, then donned her gloves again and took up tongs to lift the body from its mold. Several more minutes passed before she attached the legs with her choice of screws and bolts, and even more as she inserted gears. All the while, pounding sounded in the distance, and she glanced up to see Henry hard at work on their house, not far from the barn across from her. Its porch, or where she hoped the porch would be, facing the eastern side of her father's ranch, away from the pencil company, but still with a view of her father's house. The porch would extend to the south to give them a view of the open prairie that was part of the Bartlett ranch lands. Playing out there had long been one of her best joys, and now her mind drifted and a new child played while she stood back watching. A light touch brought her out of her reverie. Henry's. What are you dreaming of? Comfort replaced fantasy as she put her work down and stepped into his embrace. You playing with our son here one day. Is that so? He kissed her hand. One day a son? Her father spoke behind them, and Vesta sprang away from Henry. Boy, you'd better underscore that day and put it far in the future. I'm not ready to be a grandfather yet. Vesta shuffled a little further away from Henry. Daddy, I thought you'd left. I was about to, but then I saw I needed to defend your virtue first. The airship terminal won't run out of tickets before I get there, after all. I can wait a bit. He slid an arm around her and looked to her work table. Is this new, Princess? She handed him the piece. He studied it, turning it over several times to take in its hull. I think it will do nicely for a racing animal. It's got the disadvantage of being an automaton, though. I'm not sure the board will allow it. Her father set it down. You won't know until you apply. It's not ready. Though the cool brass showed no sign of her maker's mark this time, there was more to do. I've still got to fill its innards. Henry picked up and set down the little cup of gears. That shouldn't take long. Her father stepped between them. I hope it will take hours and hours, and with your help, so that you can keep your hands where they belong until the wedding. Henry's smile was all mischief. Jonathan, what do you think I'm going to do while you're gone? Since I was a child man like you once, I shudder to think. Warm heat flared in Vesta's face. Jonathan kissed her cheek. Be good, and I will give you another acre of my property when you marry my daughter properly. Don't worry, sir, Henry said. I'll keep her out of trouble as if she's already my wife. That's what I'm afraid of. That afternoon, when her father left for the airship port, Vesta stepped back into Henry's arms. Just wait until he brings Mrs. Blinkhorn here. I look forward to it. Maybe then he'll stop interrupting us. Henry leaned in as if to kiss her until Miss Grimes exited her father's house. Seeing her, he stepped away. I'd better get back. Henry headed off to the construction site. Miss Grimes stepped off the porch. Miss Vesta, I have a pot of tea ready. Will you show me again where you've hidden your honey? Dropping her head back, she sighed. I'm never going to get anything done, am I? Maybe if I go somewhere else I can... She took in the property and discarded the thought. There's nowhere better than the Republic of Texas, and no town better than mine. She set her hammers and molds aside and jogged toward her chaperone. After tea, they returned to the general store. The shopkeeper showed them a small cabinet of rings he hid in the back, safe from possible bandits. Vesta chose one, and they paid for it and exited. Walking the town, Henry hesitated outside the boarding house in which he stayed, for now. If I take your ring in there with me... A puzzled frown curved his lips. Don't get me wrong, it's a nice place, but I know boarding houses. He shoved the ring back into his pocket, and Vesta thought he kept a watchful eye on the town's citizens all the way back to their ranch. The ranch hand met her, carrying a box. You've a package. I do? She angled her head to read the label. To Miss Vesta Bartlett, Queen City, Republic of Texas. She was afraid to read the return address to see who sent it. When she did, she sighed for seeing the postmark, New Mexico. With the sunlight illuminating her father's parlor, cascading over his trunk, the simply upholstered love seats, and the polished end tables and tea cart, she opened the box. Metal chimed. Did you order new parts? Miss Grimes asked. Vesta frowned. There were various parts she did have to purchase from outsiders, but for the most part, everything worth the metal she or her father made. The packing material flopped out onto the table as Vesta dug her hands into the box. Cold metal met her touch. Her heart sank as she lifted out a little brass dog. Miss Grimes's breath smelled of mint as she leaned over to peer at the piece. Isn't that yours? Nodding, she lifted a note free and read, Dear Miss Bartlett, our son went to be with the Great Spirit last week, and we no longer have need of your gift. We offer you our thanks for the enjoyment it brought him, though not long enough. Yours, Running Cloud and Floating Deer, by the hand of William Jenkins, Reservation Representative, Jemez Pueblo, New Mexico. Oh no. She lowered the letter. The Clockwork dog blurred. A hand touched Vesta's shoulder and she sniffled. Poor boy. If I were you, Miss Grimes said, I'd send them condolences. Vesta wiped her cheeks. That's a fine idea. But first, she set the puppy on the mantel out of the way. Maybe one day she'd make use of it, but not today. She scribbled a note and set it aside, wiping her tears away. Henry entered, wiping his face on a dirty, dark blue handkerchief. Well, it's in. Is it? Vesta nearly dropped her work in her excitement. The door, anyway. Now he dug in his pocket, and withdrawing it, dropped a key in her hand. Vesta squealed happiness and hugged him. Good job, boy, Miss Grimes said. Now just finish the rest of it, and you'll be ready for your wedding day. He picked up her aether vial and added some to her new puppy's reservoir. Only a trickle of the sparkling blue concoction drizzled out. Vesta frowned and took the vial, holding it to the light. There's not much fuel left. Looks like it. Does your father have more? He does, but I thought we had more than that. Though she disappeared into his room and rummaged through his cabinet of vials, she found none. The last place she looked yielded a vial tucked into his gun safe. This is all I have. She looked to the automaton. I'll write to our supplier for more. I'm sure it'll be here in plenty of time. Or you could use coal. Coke, Henry corrected. Vesta smiled at him for remembering her words to Lady Deckvale. This is better, you know. She wrote a quick note and set it aside, then went to her father's bookcase and pulled down one of his alchemical books. Modern Alchemy, Ancient Elements by Edard Sanjay. Every element she read about flowed through her mind. This what? Miss Grimes blinked at her over her teacup. What's better than coal? Aether? Henry winked at her. But Vesta knows better than to break the law, Miss Grimes. I'm the rogue in the family, didn't you know? Surely Daddy can make something better than our usual fuel. Vesta flipped a page in the book. If he can't, you can. You think so, do you? I'll try. She shut the book and slipped her arm through Henry's. A different kind of excitement lit her heart as he nuzzled in close, and she led him across the parlor. But first, I want to see my new door. Chapter 2. The door was sturdy, and she complimented Henry on it, then went back to her work. Vesta refilled the sheep's water and tried to coax Miss Grimes into helping her with the horses before setting back to work on her automaton. Miss Grimes was having none of it. That stallion looks to be from the devil himself, Miss Vesta. Very well. Vesta took the bag of oats from her and only barely succeeded in avoiding laughter before she turned her back. Here you go, Lancelot. Don't mind her. She's just intimidated by your beauty. The stallion snorted at her, and Vesta took his response as agreement. She put the feed bag aside and opened the stall door. Besides, after my wedding day, she won't be here to bother you any longer. June 3rd can't get here soon enough, you say? She leaned close to the stallion's ear as she led him from the stall. I agree. Henry and the postman met her at the door. Evening, miss. I have a letter for your father. Henry leaned against the porch railing. I told him your father is not home and to give it to me, but he insisted. I'm sorry, it's from Mr. Bartlett only. Vesta looked from the postman to Henry. Henry shrugged. He's right. My father's gone overseas. Vesta held out her hand. I'll give it to him first thing when he gets home. When will that be? What an odd question. Before the beginning of June. Oh. The postman's face changed from bland to hesitant. Well, it's a bit urgenter than that. I suppose I've got no choice. Urgent? Excitement rippled through her. Who needed him that fast? Vesta held out her hands and wiggled her fingers. Give it to me. The postman handed it over, took her payment and the boxes she meant to deliver to the post office tomorrow, and left them. When they were alone again, Vesta read the address on the outside of the letter. A tremor started under her skin. Henry. Concern darkened his handsome, rugged face. What is it? It's from the president's office. Why do you think he's writing to him? A request for campaign contributions? It's possible, I suppose. She held the letter up to the sun and saw her father's name on the salutation. Henry laughed at her. You should open it. Miss Grimes protested. No, she shouldn't, young man. It isn't addressed to her. Why should that matter? He's her father, and keep in mind, if the president wrote to him now, what does he want? The postman implied he may need an answer right away. He was right, Vesta supposed. Papa won't be angry with me if I read his letter. I'll allow it if he does. Miss Grimes took the letter from her and, carrying it inside, set it on the mantel. Should we go to town and wire him for his permission? Vesta met Henry's gaze, and they rushed out to the stable. Once in town, they entered the telegraph office and sent the note. Dear Father, all's well here. I'm sorry to bother you so soon, but only a few minutes ago we received a letter from President Nunez. May I open it? Stop. Miss Grimes insisted I ask you first. A fine-looking gentleman, tall, thin-lipped, no tan to speak of, and light, almost white hair, with a half-open telegram in his hand, tipped his hat to them and opened the door. Vesta offered her thanks and stepped inside. The gentleman remained in the doorway, scrutinizing his letter. Vesta ignored him to continue on her own business. Two other customers waited ahead of them. The first customer accepted a message and stepped aside. The customer behind them cursed, and Vesta eyed him. The fellow at the door only succeeded in stepping out an inch or two to let someone else enter. Poor fellow, I hope the news he received isn't as terrible as he thinks. When they exited the telegraph office, the man was there, leaning against a post. He tipped his hat to them. Peering at him, she thought she noted a pin tacked on his tie, an ornament of steel in the shape of a dog. Afternoon, ma'am. Fine day, isn't it? Very. Good day. He gave her a little bow as she passed, and then she thought she heard him howl. Henry paused and turned back. Vesta glanced back at him. He hurried down the street to get lost in the crowd. Odd fellow. What? That man. Vesta pointed back to him. He's been loitering here ever since we first entered the telegraph office. You don't know him? She gave him his usual testy look. Henry, I don't know everyone in Queen City. Really? I always thought you were the belle of the ball. Back home, she set to work on her next Clockwork puppy. She just broke the head out of the mold when she noticed dust rising and a horse and rider approaching. From where she sat in the shade of the shed entrance, cleaning her nails, Miss Grimes craned her neck, peering at the trail the rider kicked up. You don't think your father sent you back a message this soon, do you? Doubtful. She set the puppy aside and exited just as the visitor rode through the gate. He dismounted his horse and straightened his fine navy blue coat as he strode forward. Miss Bartlett? The fellow paused before he approached the shed. Vesta assessed him before answering. The fellow was tall, lanky, with deep dark skin, no hair on his head, but a metal plate adorned his skull. She'd never seen him in town before, and this put her on edge. Yes? I'm Tolliver Aurelius. We've corresponded. You sent my son one of your puppies? Oh, Mr. Aurelius. Vesta offered her hand, and he shook it. What a nice surprise. We didn't know you were in town. Just for a few days. Is your father home? Not at present. What can I do for you? Aurelius looked to Henry and Miss Grimes, who'd stepped out and hovered. May we speak alone? Vesta wiped her hands and waved him inside. What did you need, Mr. Aurelius? I can make your mother another puppy, but I might not have one to spare currently. Aurelius glanced up the horseshoe over the door and nodded to it, as if in respect, then leaned against the work table. No, I'm not here about your automatons, though I know she'd enjoy one. I wondered about Aether, if you have some to spare. I put in a order for some, but seems my supplier don't think much of my order, or I don't know what. But it didn't come through as yet, and I sure do need it. Got my own order to fill quick, if you understand me. Funny, she'd done the same. We don't have much on hand ourselves, Mr. Aurelius. The dejection on his face twisted her heart. Well, shucks, I suppose I should have wired you first. I'm sure you'll have it soon. You're right, likely before I get home. He sounded confident, but didn't look it. Vesta sighed. What was a little Aether? The shipment was forthcoming. She thought the puppies she'd gotten back from the reservation might yield enough to spare in what was a few days' wait. Come inside. I think we can offer you a dram or two. Henry followed her in and into her father's interior workroom. Aside from the blacksmith's shed outside, here's where he kept the pieces and tools that couldn't withstand the elements. All his element draft bottles were here, and in the locked cabinet with his assorted collection of guns, their Aether supply. You're giving this stranger some Aether? Henry asked as she took the key from a hidden drawer above the cabinet. She slid the key into the lock. He's not a stranger. Explaining what he'd said, she donned protective gloves and portioned the precious elixir into a new bottle. Blue sparkles swirled in the stream she poured. He'd give us some if we were in need, I'm sure. All right, if you think you can trust him. He's a customer and my father's friend. Twisting the cap tight, she eyed him. That's enough to trust him. Your father's friend. Well, I will say this much for him. He doesn't strike me a bit like Acton, so I suppose he's all right. Patting his shoulder, she passed him by and turned the Aether over to her fellow tinkerer. Break. Here it comes, Napler. Watch, it'll be the prettiest explosion you've ever seen. Maynard flipped through the manifest. The papers listed the contents of each boxcar. He paid a pretty penny for the record, but it was worth it. The record listed the passengers as mostly employees of the Camden-Rio Railroad, some civilians, 38, 39. Maynard sighed. Well, there was always some collateral damage in a war. He hoped none of the passengers were younger than 18 years old. Getting closer. Crumfield's finger drifted to the button. He closed the manifest and grasped Crumfield's thin hand. Not yet. Boxcars 4 and 5 were what they needed. Maybe they wouldn't harm many that way. The engine passed over the spot, the second set of cars. Now. Crumfield hit the trigger, and a ball of glorious blue sparkling flame exploded into the night, shining off Crumfield's bald pate. The train cars bucked. Hot damn, we got 'em, Napler. Them demmed alchemists gonna be madder than a pack of bees. Charm of bees, you fool. Indeed. Maynard watched the flames shoot up, smoke billowing out, darkening an already dark night. The townsfolk may not have heard the popping beneath the screech of the train wheels, but his ears, the tinny, hollow metal shafts in his skull that served for ear canal and drum, missed nothing. He hadn't hoped for such an impressive plume, but the spirals of fire proved satisfying. The bell ringing from the church gave him his cue, the people running this way. Ugh, what a horrible stench, one would-be rescuer said. What was the train hauling? He knew exactly what it hauled, and he rejoiced in its loss. Watching Crumfield run away from the fire toward the bracken nearby where a horse waited, he dismissed him from his mind as a coward and mused on what he'd done here. It was a good thing. President Nunez would listen to his proposal now, and maybe so would all the scientists of the world. Flames scented the air with destruction and burned on into the night, and he headed home to pen a report to his colleagues. Tossing the dog pin from his jacket to the table, he settled down to write. I told you we could do this without casualties, and I was right. For now, it's done. No thanks to Crumfield. I don't wonder what the alchemists will think, and I don't care. However, if we rally Bartlett to our cause, his expertise would be welcome. Not his mechanical work, but what he's learned of the species over the years. With his connection to Queen Victoria and to Miss Bartlett's beau, they know more about dogs than any of us, I don't doubt. He reread the last line he'd written. Was Herr Colchester the one interested in canine revival? Now he saw it in black and white, he wasn't so sure. Scratching out the line, he rewrote it. All you need know is our plan is underway. If a better idea comes along, please advise. M. Chapter 3. A soft breeze blew the trees outside Vesta's window, wafting something dark across her view. What is that? She set her brush down beside a gleaming brass kitten she'd made. It meowed in protest, but she ignored it and approached the window, opened it. A slight scent of smoke filled the air. Oh my, the brass kitten hissed. Vesta threw on her robe and stepped around the depression in the rug where her pile of boxes for Britain had sat until this morning. What had happened? The question followed her as she crossed the house, unlatched the door, and stepped onto her porch. Miss Bartlett, child. Miss Grimes yawned from behind her. Are you all right? Oh dear, is something burning? I wonder the same. Vesta peered toward the stables first, didn't see so much as a flicker. Still, she ran across the farm to throw back the doors. Their horses slept in quiet peace. No evidence of the fire she smelled lingered here. Letting out a breath of relief, she circled through the stables and checked the barn, too, just to be sure. Miss Grimes called from the porch. Miss Bartlett, what is it, child? Vesta closed the barn door, yawning, checked on the house that would soon be her own. It, too, stood dark and safe from fire. What was going on? Unsure, she made a trek to her father's blacksmith shed. No, she didn't leave her portable forge burning, nor her father's big one. From there, she headed to the cottages on the south end of the ranch. Several of the ranch hands emerged from them, and she met with them. Is everyone safe? Mrs. Peabody proclaimed. Of course, Miss Bartlett, but what of you? Miss Grimes and I are fine. I checked the kitchens, the stables, everything. I can't find a fire anywhere. Mr. Peabody sniffed the air. Something is burning, though. It's not us, said thin as a rail Mrs. Kaplan, another ranch hand's wife. Our stove is out as well. I'll be jiggered, Mr. Kaplan cursed. Who's on fire, then? Vesta peered at the sky and noted the plume wafting toward town. Or from it, she wasn't sure which, and not sure she wanted the answer to Mr. Kaplan's question. The most important thing in her mind was that her friends here were safe. But what about the rest of town? What about Henry? Break. A loud explosion shook Henry out of his thoughts. He dropped the pencil he wrote with, rising from his chair. Briefly, he took in the saloon's tap room, the girls carrying trays, now motionless as statues, staring in the direction of the doors. Half the men in the tap room with him turned in their chairs, gawking likewise. Several cursed as they rose. What was that? Asked one man, a massive belly protruding over his belt and thick dark brown beard covering his chin. 3 more men raced first out of the saloon. Several others followed, including the bearded man, and he moved faster than Henry would have thought possible given his size. Henry folded his letter and placed it in his pocket before making his way outside. A strong wind whipped whirlwinds down the street. Smoke billowed over the top of the post office, rising up over the schoolhouse and the hospital, circled back to hover over the train depot, the boarding house, saloon, and the onlookers. Which direction did it come from? He wasn't sure. Other people spilled out into the street from the hotel and boarding house. The minister and his wife emerged from their house behind the town's church. More townsfolk poured out of the smaller homes outside the town's main drag. Henry dismissed them all, his attention all to the west. He cursed. He couldn't tell if the explosion happened at the Bartlett's ranch or elsewhere. "Where is that coming from? Can you make it out?" Henry asked the fellow next to him. "The desert, I think." Desert? Heart racing, he cursed under his breath and ran west, where said desert lay, beyond the Bartlett ranch. "Vesta." "It's the railroad." The call from behind stopped him in his flight. The railroad? Not Vesta's ranch, thank God. Though he hated to admit it, the relief felt good as he headed after the throng to the east side of the town to offer his assistance. Vesta stared out over the ranch. The evidence of trouble kept her from returning to her bed. The thought lingered as much as that smoke. If it was coming from in town, as she thought, Henry might be in danger. Not now, not when they fought so hard to gain each other. Percy hadn't been a bad fellow, and nor had she expected to break their engagement, nor did she fault her father for making the choice all those years ago, but no one doubted he'd chosen the wrong brother. Glad she was that they'd all agreed with her choice to accept Henry. To lose him now? She wondered if she'd ever recover from that, if indeed it happened. It might. That smoke was too much to be from a mere late-night cooking fire. We should find out where that smoke is coming from. The ranch hands' wives agreed, but pointed out, "Miss Bartlett, it's after midnight." "That's right, dearie," said Mrs. Kaplan. "Let the men deal with the problem. What can we do in the dark, after all?" They coaxed her to her parlor, where the brass puppy waited on the table. She set its switch to on and counted its laps along the table, unable to even think about sleeping. Without knowing how Henry fared, she'd get no rest. Miss Grimes dozed off in her chair by the fireplace. Someone knocked on the door. Vesta roused, and back aching from the angle she'd fallen asleep in at the table, crossed her little home to admit the visitor. "Thank God you're all right." Henry entered even before she registered that the sky was still dark. He hugged her. "I was so worried." He smelled of smoke. "I was worried about you." She tightened her grip, hanging on, feeling his heart beat against hers, listening to his easy breath. He was alive. Her dearest love was well. Knowing this, she shook all the more, dizzy with relief. "But we're all right." She looked to Miss Grimes. The spinster sat up in the chair and pulled the woven blanket tighter around her thin person. "I was afraid it was you until I realized the railroad was the cause." "The railroad?" Vesta blinked and approached her kitchen stove, set water to boiling. "Did they derail?" "Hard for me to say." Setting a hand on her hip, she glared at him. "You're impossible. Didn't you ask?" "I was more concerned with you. I thought the smoke was coming from out this way, or that's what I heard." He sniffed. The water boiled, and she removed it from her stove top and poured it out into cups. "What caused that loud bang we heard?" "I can't say. Something in one of the boxcars. I guess they were hauling gunpowder or coal." Vesta stared up from her work. "Or aether." "Oh my." Miss Grimes pointed to the stove. "Coal, most like. Was anyone—" She paused and her gaze unfocused. "Forgive me. I must be tired. I thought to ask if anyone was hurt. But of course there were casualties." She nodded resolutely. "I'll pray for them." Vesta touched Henry's arm. "We all will, I'm sure." The next morning they confirmed that the train indeed had crashed. The town set up a bucket brigade, and townsfolk carried water from the communal well and from wells on their own farms. Henry held Vesta's hand as they sat together, Vesta helping to take names of people looking for loved ones. A stream of doctors and victims made for the town hospital, and even some wounded who might fare the journey better found themselves bound for the next closest town. Meanwhile, the sheriff stalked among the victims, asking questions and taking notes. Vesta wondered who accompanied the aether shipment. Did the shaman come himself? Was he here somewhere in the wreckage? The gossip of the working townsfolk gained her a few tidbits of information. "Engineer was drunk," one man said to another. "I even saw him go straight to the saloon after the wreck." You're wrong, Abel. Sheriff dragged him into jail. I'd stake my property on the fact that he was sober when he did so. I saw him at the saloon later in the night, another said. And before. My friend told me he saw him swaying on his feet when the sheriff led him away. At least no one yet discerned what she most feared. She wondered if the letter she'd received addressed the shipment. Maybe the president was changing his course on the subject of Aether and wanted her father to know personally. He is somewhat of a celebrity, Henry said when she mentioned her musings to him. The speed trials were years ago. Surely it's not about that. Miss Grimes is determined to wire my father. I'm not sure I want her to, except what? He nodded to another man who walked away from her table. You don't want him to kill me for not keeping you safe? How kind of you. Leaning back in her chair before the next woman approached, she scoffed. Of course not, but less importantly, I don't want him to worry. Henry shook his head and joined the cleanup crew. The approaching sunset saw one girl bickering with another. Now look what you did, Mary. I gotta pay and get this fixed. The pouting cry drew the mother's, then Vesta's, attention to see the girl's brass middle finger hanging off her hand by a strict screw. I can help you with that. Volunteering her services, Vesta brought forth the screwdriver she always carried. All three of them finally adjourned at 4 o'clock. Henry took a detour to the east side of town to speak to a fellow about a piece of property. The fellow owned several acres and buildings, and few animals for those buildings. A pond took up part of the property Henry said he might make use of for a cooling tank for his foundry. The fellow listened to his offer to buy, and Vesta noticed him studying her a moment before turning his attention back to Henry. His question gave her the answer. You want to build a house for your girl? Not a house, a factory. I'll give you a fair price for the land. How does $35 sound? The fellow surveyed the land from the porch rocking chair in which he sat. The wind stirred the wisps of bangs, which was all the hair he had left, though he didn't seem older than Jonathan. 35 per half acre? Vesta gazed out at the property. 4 acres in total. $280? I'm not sure. Henry rubbed his chin. I've only got 35, but I might be able to add an extra 30. They returned to the ranch and Vesta eyed him. You don't only have $65 to your name, do you? On me? Henry urged the cart horses into a trot. Of course not, but I'd be a fool to tell him. Acton trained me better than that. Vesta stopped by her ranch foreman's home, and a half hour of fretting ensued. Mrs. Peabody even made them dinner and handed Vesta a stack of mail, which she didn't touch until they got home. How long after you finished that roof now? She lit a gas lamp and turned over the mail. Before the wreck, a few days, 2 maybe. He looked away from the trail leading back to her father's ranch. Now, it might be into next week, what with your town helping out with the crash. My work may be stalled too. She lowered her voice. I'm sure that train hauled our supply of Aether. He studied her, then glanced at her brass puppy's hull where it lay on the table, upended. What are you going to do about it? Tell my father? I don't know. She rose and picked up the puppy. Maybe it's not necessary. He winked at her. You are a genius, after all. Henry changed the subject by muttering his affections in her ear and caressed her cheek. I don't think she'd notice if we kept your bedroom door locked. A pretty pink blush tinged her cheeks that made him smile. Miss Grimes screamed from the stable, and Vesta found one of her horses, Guinevere, making a dinner of Miss Grimes's hat. Lancelot, too, was taking particular interest in the feather in the hat, despite Miss Grimes's protests. It took her a few hours to calm the old lady down and keep from laughing in her face. Break. Returning to the town inn for the night, Vesta kept a tight hold of Henry's thoughts. After all that had happened in the last year, it still amazed him that the girl who'd once been off limits and betrothed to his brother loved him instead, and indeed accepted his proposal for marriage. He had his brother to thank for her affections and did so in his latest letter. He'd send it off tomorrow. Percy's questions about the foundry demanded quick answers. Would that he could be in Nottingham and have Vesta by his side. but she loved her Texas home, and the note from Percy was encouraging. Milda has done what she can to answer most of my questions. I hear Mr. Bartlett's coming back to town, so I hope he won't mind offering some advice. But without them, without you, I'm hopeless. Percy, no doubt, had gleaned more over the last few months working in the foundry, hands-on, than in the years before. Hearing his father yammer on about the job compared little to doing the real work. You'll understand it eventually, Henry wrote. In fact, I'm sure you're doing better than you think. He hoped so. He didn't want to read the rest of Percy's letter regarding his father's financial well-being. As they'd left things, they still owned their one horse in their houses at Netherfield and Nottingham and the foundry, and that was how he wanted to keep things. He didn't want to hear they'd lost the house he grew up in or the Netherfield property. He'd get the full story from Acton if the fellow ever deigned to answer his latest letter. What did his father decide to do about the Queen's request for iron? Percy didn't say, but mentioned that a shipment of their iron should arrive on Vesta's doorstep within the week. That's a relief. He knew buying it locally was an option, but with her now family connection to a working foundry, Henry hated to allow her to spend the money, not when he could bear the cost of the shipment through his bloodline. Henry arrived again just after sunset. Vesta let him in, one eye on the kitchen. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "A test." Vesta drew him into the parlor. Here, she'd set a brass puppy to walking across the table. Henry gazed down on it. "What are you testing?" "The power source." The puppy marched to the end of the table. She turned it around and marked down in her notebook whenever it returned. Then she'd turn it around and send it back the other way. The automaton clacked and whirred as it marched across the scarred table. Tiny iron paws thumped against the wood. Vesta kept an eye on it, another on the pocket watch in her hand. The day's heat sluiced through the open windows. Thin tendrils of steam rose from the metal mutt's nose, white, smelling of aether. None of this bothered Vesta, except for a pause to dab a line of sweat from under her nose with a fine linen handkerchief. She kept all her attention on the automaton. 259,000, and I'm doing this because it gives me something else to think about than the crash. It's over with, except for the cleaning. I'm not so sure. He folded her hands into his and kissed her. The little brass puppy bumped their hands, and Henry smiled, set it off to the side. "How do you stop this confounded thing?" Vesta took it from him and, turning it over, flipped the power lever, then turned back to her book on Alessandro Volta. Henry patted the Clockwork puppy's head. "There now. Does he growl in his sleep?" Vesta blinked and looked at her notepad. "Should I? It would make them more lifelike." Henry waved a hand before her eyes. "I was teasing. There are more important things to consider. Like, have you heard anything from your father yet?" "I did." His answer, how could she have forgotten it? But Miss Grimes's problem with Guinevere threw it right out of my head. Miserable mare. Miss Grimes voiced her complaint while rocking the parlor rocking chair hard against the floor. Vesta covered the laugh that threatened and brought the telegram from her room. "Here it is. Miss Grimes, you read it. That way you'll know she's telling the truth." Vesta scoffed and swatted a hand at Henry. Miss Grimes smoothed the telegram out and read in her thin, aging voice. "To Miss Vesta Bartlett and Miss Grimes. Yes, of course you may open the letter, Vesta, my love." Miss Grimes peered at her. "I'd be a fool to believe you didn't send this to her, Henry." "Me? Why would I do that?" Henry laid a hand to his chest. "What else does he say?" Vesta took the telegram back from her and continued reading. "Henceforth, until my return, Vesta may open any and all mail addressed to me. If you doubt her word, ask Miss Peabody to read it for you. Likely this letter is nothing more important than a request for money. Or, if we're lucky, Nunez just wants me to autograph the photo from my speed trials." He concluded the message with, "Mrs. Blinkhorn and son are doing well. I hope to see you before Decoration Day. Your loving father." "There, Miss Grimes, you see? I knew he wouldn't protest." Henry waved a hand to her. "Those two are usually of one mind. Stay here long enough, and you'll note them finishing each other's sentences." "My niece said you were strange folk." Vesta blinked. "Now, Miss Grimes." Henry rubbed his chin. I've been called worse, so I thank you for the compliment. You see, Miss Grimes, Father gave me permission to conduct his business. Vesta drew her attention back. Let's see what that earlier telegram has to say, shall we? Henry rose from the love seat and plucked the telegram from the mantel. Miss Grimes, would you like to do the honors? The older woman took the telegram from him and broke the seal. Vesta crossed her fingers, hoping Miss Grimes wouldn't change her mind. Miss Grimes stared at her. It truly is from the president. Vesta rose from her chair to round the woman and read over her shoulder. What's he say? Henry angled his head to read. Vesta was sure he didn't see very much from where he sat. She took the letter from Miss Grimes. Mr. Bartlett, your current project, the one of which we're told you're collaborating with colleagues of Lady Deckvale, has come to my attention, and I would like to know more. President Nunez knew about her clockwork animals for the British Army? She turned her attention back to the letter and continued reading. I have an appointment available on Monday, May 21st at 6 p.m., if you would be so kind as to accept my invitation to dinner. Miss Grimes gasped. That soon? Oh dear, he can't. Why not? Sir, do you see Mr. Bartlett here? He's overseas, you know. This is only the 14th. And how long will it take him to conclude his business in London and get home? Nottingham, Henry corrected. And not very long, but he doesn't have to be there. The project is Vesta shook her head in warning. Henry smiled at her chaperone. Vesta and I collaborated with him on the project. We'll meet with President Nunez. I'm sure they won't turn us away. Vesta wasn't, especially after her reception from the Crown. They dragged their feet and sent her home before they decided to make an offer for her creations, no matter the fact that everyone assured her the Queen wanted her mechanical pets. She looked to the puppy she'd set aside and wondered, what did President Nunez want from her? Did he truly know about the project? There's another consideration. She touched the letter again. Think of how this is worded. Does it sound to you like he gave my father a choice in this matter? I say again, Miss Grimes tapped her hand on the chair's arm. Your father can't meet with anyone in Austin, as he's in Nottingham. Today is Monday. Unless he received the message overnight, he won't make this meeting. Is that not so? Airships aren't that fast, are they? Henry chuckled. Miss Grimes, have you never traveled by airship? Not once. Do you think me out of my head, young man? Oh, we'll make the meeting. Vesta folded the letter. It wouldn't be the first time Henry's been our representative. The nod he gave assured her he knew she wouldn't let him attend this appointment alone.